Food powder as first iteration to outsourcing preparation of healthy food while keeping customer decision agency. It seems to me, at least for me, that there is a giant problem, which is that I cannot go to any restaurant, that I cannot go into any grocery store, that I cannot go anywhere where food is made or drinks are made, if I don't want to expose myself to an incentive that is not aligned with my incentive, which is trying to live a healthy and long life. Because I'm trying to live a healthy and long life over the last couple of years, I developed a couple of hardliner rules, which I usually try to implement, which is that I don't eat sugar, I don't drink alcohol, I try to basically be on the lower side of carbs, I try to eat as healthy as I possibly can, I try to work out is also maybe as hard as I possibly can while still being able to regenerate from these. Now, I don't want to sound like is actually kind of not the right thing. I also don't want to say I don't want to make it seem like I try to work out hard, because it seems that this is a useful adaptation, or not a useful adaptation, but kind of I'm getting into a side tangent here. Let's get back to the problem. Food powder as a first iteration to outsourcing preparation of healthy food. Now, apart from this problem of the incentive misalignment, one could say, if I go to a restaurant, and I have often used this example now, I think, I made this up once, maybe I just copy pasted it from someone else. Let's say there's a bakery, and initially none of breads had sugar in them. And then somebody realized that if he puts a little bit of sugar into the bread, then people tend to like it more. Why do they tend to like it more? Because maybe in the past, eat as much fat and sugar as you can was a useful rule, because sugar and fat were scarce and calories were scarce. So therefore they improved the chance of the genes propagating into the next generation. Whereas these days, due to the more or less abundance of these things, it is less of a useful rule or simplification algorithm. Now, currently, all of the food that is offered always runs on kind of the same incentive scheme that the company wants to. I mean, this would be also true for other iterations of this, but the question is not whether this is true or not true, but to which extent it could be basically be less of a variable. And so now, what I've tried to find a solution for myself mostly for this. And so I don't go to restaurants usually, I try to avoid them. Why? Because every time I go to a restaurant, I don't get the macronutrients and micronutrients out from the meal I ideally would have. So, or ideally would give my body. So, a very simplified approach would be this. My body, at a certain point in time, and everybody else's body, I assume also, has a certain need for nutrients. Ideally, this need for nutrients would be fulfilled with eating or drinking water, if one assumes water is also a nutrient. Now, this would be kind of a vector going maybe into 3D space. Let's just say 3D space, we have three variables. These are the three macronutrients: protein, fat, as well as carbs. So now there's an ideal ratio out of these three, which is basically a point in this 3D vector space. Now, every time you go to a restaurant, the restaurant has a different incentive, which is so you try to survive, but the restaurant also tries to survive. Because the restaurant also tries to survive, it needs to make people, to a certain extent at least, dependent on buying from the restaurant. Or at least make it more likely that people will return. And so one has the incentive that when then the first bakery starts to put a little bit sugar into something and then realizes, okay, they sell more, then the bakery has an advantage over the other bakery that does not do this. Then maybe the other one employs a spy, and then the other baker finds out about this, and first he is like, oh, how can you even put sugar in the bread? And then he realizes, oh, it actually tastes better, and also I probably sell more if I do this, so he also does it. And the other baker, then maybe a third baker, comes up with maybe 2 grams of sugar per 100 grams of bread, and he sells even more, so the other two decide together to, well, also now join the club, because otherwise they have to go out of business. And so there is kind of this increasing thing where, even though nobody wanted it in the first place, because it is kind of it seems to be kind of an optimal. It is kind of exploiting this previous rule of ours, maybe, that we eat as much fat and sugar as we possibly can, and it is basically driving all of these different entities that operate under this umbrella of trying to make food towards this thing that is actually kind of just a reflection of our minds. Now, to To get rid of this, one would probably have to have a top-down approach, unless one gene edits kind of this out of us, or invents something like Ozempic, which then kind of alters basically how we interact with the things that are around us. One could also, to a certain extent, call this food environment hostile. It is not basically every time I go to the grocery store and I buy 10 protein bars because they are sweetened, and this is kind of an exception in my diet, I then am not only wasting financial resources, but I'm also getting these additional additives, which to a certain extent at least give me headaches. And if I have a really bad day in terms of plan implementation, and I might get a cake or something like this, which is ridiculous, but I did in the past, then I am not only wasting my financial resources, but also kind of my health resources. Basically, I'm wasting life points. I'm wasting minutes at the end of my life just for eating this right now, even though it basically has no benefit. It also probably depletes my dopamine system, which then means that I won't enjoy the things or food in the normal food I eat in the next couple of hours to days, and so it's basically a net negative, one could say, very, very easily. Now, of course, people also like to enjoy eating cakes and so on and so forth, but maybe people also like to enjoy to work. But the question is, how much do we enjoy this? As a child, as a teenager, I often saw this following concept kind of implemented in how I saw things. Whenever I took something that was very hard out of my week, it seemed over time, kind of all of the other things seemed to adapt until I had kind of a similar level of hardness again. And if I then introduced something which I really didn't enjoy, then all of the other things just suddenly became kind of easier, because the comparison game seems to be working in the way that the hardest thing kind of sets the expectation maximum level of non-enjoyment, and then the other things relative to this seem to be more enjoyable. So learning could be suddenly enjoyable if the alternative is to, I don't know, do something that is worse than learning. It depends, of course, also on the frame of doing activities one has, and so on and so forth. So now, why maybe food powder? In the last couple of years, I tried to, first of all, find a solution for myself that is ideally basically, I wasted lots of time on cooking, on meal prepping, on grocery shopping, and also on just basically I'm wasting constantly. As it's almost like a virus. I have to constantly basically prevent myself from basically getting to the next worst allocation in terms of my nutrition, basically to not eat junk food. Whenever I travel, for example, and I'm on a train station at night, and then there is a snack bar vending machine in front of me, and the options in there are ridiculous compared to, I recently had the following idea. What if you just took all cigarette automats or vending machines and just replaced them with protein bars instead? Wouldn't this be a nice idea? Of course, multiple constraints and implementation difficulties. Now back to the food powder. For me now, this seems to somehow work. I can get all the different ingredients. I can also order the different ingredients. Also, food powder is not something that is like, it is kind of it's not so similar to food. It's more like drinking. And because it's more like drinking, it's more like, okay, I just drink this and I don't even need to enjoy it, because it's okay, I'm just drinking this, and I'm not like 20 minutes eating something, and if I'm eating something I might as well read something, but then I pay less attention to satiety signals and so on and so forth. So it's kind of it's bypassing this eating frame to a certain extent and accessing the drinking frame. And by drinking the nutrients, one is therefore kind of bypassing this. I need to enjoy this food right now, to a certain extent at least, it seems to me. Now, the agency of choosing your own food in a restaurant, for example, of course this is also, I'm choosing the food out of the foods you're offering me. I'm also choosing the foods out of the restaurant. All of us together basically made an agreement on where to go. But the agreement on where to go is also partially, at least probably, influenced by the past experiences of exposure to the given food at this restaurant. So if it's a McDonald's, then everybody knows that the bread tastes sweet. It's not that everybody knows it, it's just subconsciously probably one is driven towards then maybe seeking out McDonald's instead of eating 2 tomatoes. Now, food powder, on the other side, is So there is another problem, and this other problem is not necessarily a problem. I mean, if people want to spend time cooking, then they can spend time cooking. It is just, if cooking wouldn't be necessary, then it would be a choice. Similarly to how many people these days, at least in some parts of the world, work basically in front of a computer, and they don't have to physically work all day in the fields, for example, because now this has been taken over. So the different functions of working outside have basically been taken apart, and they have been taken apart and individually optimized, one could say. So there is now a farmer who has multiple tractors and who has also fertilizer and produces way more than someone could do in the past alone. And because of this, basically all the different parts of society can now contribute to a bigger overall cake, one could say. They can make a bigger cake overall. And of course, cake. Why cake? Because cake tastes so good, and well, which is just a reflection of exactly this problem I am trying to discuss here. Now, one could say that currently lots of people get tomatoes, then they wash the tomatoes and they get them home. What if there is an additional step, which is that already the preparation of the meals happens? At least, so you could either have meal preps, so basically meal prep meals, and then deliver them to you. But then this is again just too close maybe to the restaurant thing. And the restaurant thing is still, okay, I'm eating this food, I might enjoy the food, but by drinking the food, of course not everybody has to now drink milkshakes. That's not a solution here. But similarly to how it is now an option to kind of work in the field these days, and it might even be an experience, but instead people kind of now have dedicated time towards kind of having their body optimized in terms of working out. So basically one took the different variables out of this initial thing, which is working out in the fields, which would provide physical exercise, but the physical exercise would also vary. So by basically taking this and now kind of being able to control it with going to the gym, going for a run, basically making up an exercise plan, which then can be optimized more. One could also take out the different variables of the current food consumption and optimize them more if one takes the individual factors of what makes up food consumption and cooking and so on. So one could say, there are maybe multiple things that kind of could result out of this. First of all, one could say, okay, all the different foods we have, we make available as a food powder. Of course, this is not just a demand thing to a certain extent. If many people would demand chicken protein powder, then chicken protein powder probably would be made. Now, of course, there is also the ethical concern of eating food, maybe, at least in my eyes, I'm still struggling with this, but I also seem to kind of need it, which to a certain extent seems to also kind of negatively impact the extrapolation from our behavior, from humans' behavior towards animals, and the cruelty, possibly, if one describes this as cruelty. Similarly, or it seems to extrapolate it to maybe also what would a higher intelligence, an entity higher than human intelligence do maybe with humans in a similar fashion. This wasn't maybe not a good sentence, maybe not. So by making food powder, one could first of all just turn all the different foods that are available in a grocery store into food powder. Of course, there might be different problems with this, like tomatoes. Turning tomatoes into tomato powder might get rid of some possible positive things like the freshness of the tomato, and also maybe it needs to be in a certain structure, and maybe also the fiber needs to be in a certain structure to properly fit into digestion. Food powder is just the current iteration of maybe the separation of these different variables that contribute basically to the overall positive effect of food. I, over the last years, have cooked often for myself. I have meal prepped for myself. I tried making shakes. I tried making shakes in the microwave with eggs together, and then I called this protein eggs, and put them into glasses and put them into the freezer, and then to take them with me into the library or to whatever I was at this specific day. But this is very time consuming. Similarly to how basically nowadays everybody cooks. Not everybody cooks, many people don't cook. But I, at least to a certain extent, think it's kind of necessary, at least. I mean, I've also tried different things not to cook, but it seems always to come down to the idea that if I expose myself to an incentive structure that doesn't align basically with me trying to optimize my health, then I'm exposed to this incentive structure, and then I might buy things in the grocery store which I did not intend rationally, which is ridiculous. Now, food powder seems to be kind of basically a way out of this, at least as of currently. Maybe we come up with something better than food powder. Maybe it is just cooking the food and actually having ready-made meals in the supermarket already, but then the question is how much more do they cost? Of course, there probably might be an additional profit margin, but similarly to how maybe a couple of 100 years ago most people just made their own food and also kept their own food, then this process got kind of optimized and industrialized. Why not optimize and industrialize the cooking part? Of course, maybe it's necessary every now and then to have a meal together, but for me, for example, I just marginally replaced kind of meals I otherwise would have kind of normally with just a food shake, which consists of protein powder and maybe also a leverage for fiber or a lever for fiber and so on and so forth. So it's then an option, similarly to how going for a hike is now an option, and you don't need to just walk to the next city because there are no horses and there are no cars and there are no trains.